Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's jump in. It started like any other day. The sun rose over the horizon, the streets buzzed with the noise of everyday life, and the world moved on as usual. People were busy with their routines, some grumbling about the morning traffic, others rushing to get to work. But then, without warning, everything changed. The sky above the world cracked open like a giant fracture in the universe, and through it came massive ships, dark, ominous, and alien. At first, no one knew what was happening. People looked up in disbelief, some even thinking it was some kind of strange optical illusion or government experiment gone wrong. But the hum that reverberated through the air was too real to ignore. The noise seemed to pierce deep into their bones, sending a chill through the streets. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't a new aircraft, it was something far worse. The ships were descending, and they weren't here for peace. Then, the first explosion shattered the silence. A city, gone in an instant, swallowed by a blinding flash. The world watched in horror as entire metropolises were reduced to rubble. No message, no demands, just destruction. Governments reacted in panic, launching every defense they had. But it was futile. Nuclear missiles were intercepted mid-flight, and fighter jets were shot down before they even got close. No one had ever seen technology like this. And worse, it wasn't just the weapons they feared. It was the sheer indifference of the invaders. They didn't even seem to care about the humans they were killing. Earth was nothing but a speck to them, an insignificant world to crush beneath their heel. And yet, there was still a flicker of defiance. If Earth had any hope, it was quickly fading. The attacks weren't just limited to major cities. Small towns were wiped off the map. Entire regions vanished in seconds. It felt like humanity had no chance, like the world was being torn apart piece by piece. But if Earth couldn't fight back, then it wouldn't just be cities that were lost. It would be everything. The world would fall, and humanity would be wiped out. But as the fires of destruction burned brighter, something strange began to happen. Despite all the odds, one person didn't give in. One person didn't run. In a tiny remote town in Montana, a retired engineer named Marcus Lane stood alone in the face of total annihilation. While the world cried out for a miracle, he quietly worked in his basement, piecing together something no one could have imagined. It wasn't a weapon anyone had ever designed before, not even Marcus. He had no blueprint, no instructions, just his mind and a whole lot of scraps. It took him 3 days, welding and crafting in the chaos, until he emerged with a contraption that looked like nothing more than a junkyard project. But when he powered it up and aimed it at the invaders, something incredible happened. A single pulse of energy shot out, and in the blink of an eye, the alien ship was gone. Not destroyed, not burning, simply gone. The invaders had thought they were unstoppable, but now for the first time they weren't so sure. Marcus had done the impossible. And in that moment, the world began to realize something they hadn't dared believe before. Earth might just have a chance after all. When Marcus made that first strike, it wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for all of Earth. News spread fast, and humanity's spirit surged with renewed hope. They had seen something they never thought possible. A single human, alone, standing against a force that had wiped entire cities off the map. But Marcus didn't see himself as a hero. He wasn't looking for fame or glory. He had simply done what anyone would have done, fought to survive. But to the world, he had become a symbol of something far greater than just resistance. He was proof that humanity wasn't done yet, that Earth wasn't going to roll over and die. Leaders around the world saw the potential in Marcus's invention, and they scrambled to find him. Governments, military officials, scientists, they all came calling, wanting to know how he had built the weapon and how they could replicate it. Marcus didn't have the answers. He had acted on impulse, building what he could with whatever he had. No one could reverse engineer what he had done. There were no plans, no notes, just a device born from the desperate will to fight back. He had no clue how it worked, and that's what scared the world. If humanity was going to survive, they had to figure out how to make more of these weapons, and fast. But as Marcus's fame spread, so did the pressure. Governments weren't just asking for his help, they were demanding it. They came with offers, with threats, and with ultimatums. But Marcus wasn't interested in being controlled. He had done what needed to be done for his town, for his people. But he wasn't going to hand over the weapon. He wouldn't let the governments take it and use it for their own purposes. They didn't understand what it meant to fight back, not truly. They didn't understand the price of survival. So, Marcus stayed silent. He didn't back down, not even when the helicopters and military personnel descended on his small town. For days, the world's most powerful figures tried to force his hand. They came with words, with threats, with bribes. But Marcus wouldn't budge. And when they finally tried to take the weapon by force, that's when the world saw what kind of man Marcus Lane really was. The small town that had once been forgotten became the epicenter of a fight for freedom. Marcus didn't just fight for his town, he fought for every single person on Earth. And for a while, it looked like humanity was going to win this fight too. As the weeks passed after Marcus's defiant stand, something unexpected began to unfold across the globe. The small town of Montana, once a quiet and forgotten place, had become the epicenter of humanity's rebellion. News outlets from all over the world broadcasted the images of Marcus standing tall against overwhelming odds. What started as an act of desperation, an engineer fighting for survival in the face of annihilation, had sparked something greater, something that humans had long forgotten about, a sense of unity. The world had been fractured for so long. Political divisions, wars, and petty disagreements had often kept humanity from seeing its true potential. But now, the enemy was too great, too vast, and too destructive to allow the world to remain divided. It didn't matter anymore where you came from or what flag you waved. The enemy didn't care. They were here to conquer, and if Earth had any hope of surviving, it would have to be united. And so it began. A quiet but powerful shift. Governments, once reluctant to cooperate, now put aside their differences, pooling resources, sharing intelligence, and coming together in a way that had never been seen before. In the wake of Marcus's victory, world leaders made the decision to form a unified front. The United Nations, the European Union, the United States, every major power on Earth decided that the only way to survive this was together. They established the Global Resistance Coalition, GRC, a task force designed to pool humanity's knowledge and resources into one singular effort. The goal? To reverse engineer Marcus's weapon and develop new technologies capable of fighting back the invaders. It wasn't easy. The alien technology was so advanced that many scientists struggled just to understand its basic principles. Marcus's device was a marvel, but it was also a mystery. No one knew how he had made it work, not even Marcus himself. It had been built in a frenzy, in the chaos of those early days, when he'd had nothing but his hands and his instincts to guide him. For days, Marcus tried to help them. He would sit with scientists, trying to explain what he had done, but the more he spoke, the more he realized how little he actually understood. They tried to reverse engineer his creation, but they couldn't. They couldn't figure out the wiring or the power source, let alone how to replicate it. It was a dead end. The GRC could only move forward in the dark. They had the knowledge that the weapon worked, but not how or why. Meanwhile, Marcus had become a symbol, not just of defiance, but of the resilience of humanity. People from all corners of the world began to see him not just as an engineer, but as a leader. They saw the determination in his eyes, the refusal to bow, the courage to stand against an enemy that was unstoppable by any known means. But Marcus didn't see himself as a leader. He had never wanted to be one. He was just a man who had built something to save his town, his family, his people. He wasn't looking for fame. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But now, everywhere he went, he was met with awe. The world needed hope, and they saw that hope in Marcus Lane. And while the world moved forward in an effort to build weapons and defend their planet, something far darker was brewing in the depths of space. The invaders, who had initially hesitated after Marcus's strike, were far from finished. The brief moment of uncertainty had passed, and the enemy was regrouping, preparing for a much larger and more devastating return. The alien commanders were not happy. They had underestimated Earth. They had thought that humanity would fall like so many other worlds they had conquered. But the resistance, no matter how small, had caught them off guard. They hadn't expected Earth to fight back, and now they had learned their lesson. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The alien fleet, which had once been a terror from the sky, had retreated to lick its wounds. But that retreat was only temporary. In the cold, dark depths of space, the invaders began to regroup, rebuild, and prepare. Their ships, which had seemed nearly invincible, were now being reinforced with new technology, new weapons, and an army more terrifying than anything humanity had ever faced. The aliens weren't just going to come back with the same ships. They were going to come back with something bigger, something more lethal. The commanders knew that the battle for Earth wasn't just about conquering the planet. It was about crushing any trace of resistance. The humans had dared to defy them, and they would pay for it. The invaders would not let this world stand. Back on Earth, the preparations for the next phase of the war were underway. Every country, every city, was in a state of heightened readiness. Governments poured resources into the creation of new weapons, new strategies, and new technologies. Marcus Lane's weapon was still the most advanced thing they had, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed to be ready for the aliens' return. As the days turned into weeks and then months, Marcus found himself swept up in the whirlwind of the human response. The once quiet man who had preferred to live in his small town, away from the limelight, was now a global figure. Every major military leader, every top scientist wanted to meet him, to ask him questions, to learn from him. But the more people sought him out, the more Marcus withdrew into himself. He had built the weapon out of necessity, not out of ambition. He had fought back because his world was on the brink of extinction, and he couldn't just sit back and watch as it was destroyed. But now that the world had taken notice, he began to see the darker side of his role in this global struggle. The pressure to keep coming up with answers, to lead, to be the one everyone looked to. It was suffocating. And as the invaders began to make their preparations, a gnawing fear began to settle in Marcus's chest. The weapon he had built, the device that had bought humanity a chance, wasn't enough. The invaders would return, and when they did, Earth would need more than just one man and his satellite dish. They needed a global defense, something that could stand against the tide of destruction that was coming. In secret military bunkers around the world, scientists and engineers worked day and night, trying to perfect what Marcus had started. The goal was simple: to create a weapon that could turn the tide in humanity's favor. But every day, the deadline grew closer, and the sense of urgency became more pronounced. They had no choice. As the months wore on, Marcus found himself isolated once again. The pressure to perform, to lead, to provide answers was overwhelming. But in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts, a chilling realization began to settle in his mind. No matter how hard they tried, humanity was not ready. The alien threat was still out there, looming in the darkness of space, and soon it would return with a force greater than anything they could imagine. But Marcus knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. As the world prepared for the inevitable return of the alien invaders, a strange sense of urgency gripped humanity. There was no longer any room for political squabbles or territorial disputes. Old rivalries and borders had been torn apart by the wake of the invasion, leaving only one common goal: survival. The Global Resistance Coalition, led by the most brilliant minds from every corner of the Earth, worked tirelessly to develop new weapons, technologies, and strategies to protect the planet. But as the clock ticked down, the pressure on Marcus grew unbearable. The small, makeshift command centers that had sprung up across the globe had become a web of activity. Soldiers, engineers, and scientists labored in secrecy, pushing themselves beyond their limits to create what would hopefully be humanity's saving grace. Marcus was often called upon to offer advice, and though he tried to keep a low profile, his expertise was invaluable. He had seen firsthand what the invaders were capable of, and more importantly, what they were not capable of. There was a chink in their armor, something he hadn't quite understood but had sensed ever since that first shot he fired. The question, however, was whether humanity could exploit that weakness before it was too late. Back in Montana, where it all began, the small town had transformed. What was once a peaceful, quiet place was now a strategic stronghold. Soldiers from all over the world had arrived, and the town had been fortified with weapons and defense systems. It was no longer just a town. It had become the symbol of humanity's defiance, the place where the tide had turned. Marcus's house, once a humble, weathered building, now stood at the heart of a military compound. The battles that would decide Earth's future would likely be fought on the soil of his land. The pressure was immense, and Marcus could feel the weight of it with every breath he took. But despite the preparations, there was a haunting quiet in the air. It wasn't the peace of a world that had triumphed. It was the eerie calm before the storm. People whispered about the aliens' return, their eyes darting nervously to the skies, as though the invaders might appear at any moment. Each day felt like an eternity as the countdown to the inevitable approached. Everyone knew that the first wave would be worse than the last. The invaders had been defeated once, but they would not make the same mistakes again. They were going to come back stronger, smarter, and more ruthless. As humanity continued to prepare, the first signs of the invaders' return began to manifest. Satellites detected an abnormal energy signature, something unlike anything Earth had ever seen before. It wasn't just one ship. It was an entire fleet, hidden in the vast expanse of deep space, gathering strength and resources for their next assault. The invaders had learned from their previous failure. They weren't just coming with warships and weapons. They were coming with an army like nothing the world had ever encountered. For weeks, military personnel, intelligence agencies, and even private companies scoured the globe for any information that might give them an edge. Marcus, though tired and worn, remained at the heart of the effort. But even his determination couldn't mask the growing fear that gnawed at him. He knew the enemy's technology was light years ahead of anything humanity had. He had no illusions about their chances. Even with all the advances humanity had made, he understood that the invaders could still wipe them out with a single strike. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Marcus refused to succumb to despair. If there was one thing he had learned from the first battle, it was this: humanity wasn't finished. Not yet. The human spirit, the unyielding will to survive, was something the invaders had not accounted for, and that, Marcus believed, was their greatest weapon. But even with the world united and their defenses steadily improving, there was still one glaring issue that haunted Marcus. He had no idea how the device he had built actually worked. It had been a fluke, a desperate last-ditch effort that had succeeded against all odds. Now, humanity was pinning its hopes on that single act of brilliance. They couldn't build more devices like it. They couldn't replicate it. And worse, they had no understanding of how or why it had worked. That lack of knowledge was a ticking time bomb. If the invaders learned from their mistakes, humanity might find itself defenseless. Marcus spent more and more time in his garage, surrounded by scattered pieces of scrap metal, broken electronics, and half-finished machines. The others tried to involve him in the global effort, but the questions and decisions began to feel too overwhelming. No matter how many people came to him for advice, no one had the answers. Not even he did. He had no formal training in alien technology. All he had was his wits and the desperation to stop the destruction of his home. That's when the cracks started to show in the grand plan. One evening, while Marcus was deep in thought, trying to reverse engineer his device one more time, a soldier walked into the room. His face was grim, his eyes hollow. He spoke only one word. "It's happening." The words hit Marcus like a slap. He had known this day would come, the day the invaders would return, but hearing it aloud was a bitter reminder that time was no longer on their side. The fleet, the one they had feared for so long, had entered Earth's atmosphere. They were coming, and they weren't coming alone. The fleet that had once seemed invincible was now accompanied by a new threat: massive alien bio-creatures. These monstrous beings were unlike anything humanity had encountered. They were bioengineered soldiers, created by the invaders to serve as an unstoppable force on the ground. They were fast, strong, and relentless. The invaders had learned from their last encounter. The armies they had sent were just a part of the puzzle. The real strength lay in these creatures. The first wave of ships descended on Earth with terrifying speed. They filled the sky, blotting out the sun, casting a shadow over the planet. The air crackled with energy as the alien fleet made its presence known. The world's military forces scrambled to respond, but they knew they were outmatched. The alien ships were nearly indestructible, and their weapons could wipe out entire cities in seconds. As Marcus looked up at the sky, the magnitude of the situation hit him with full force. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. This was a fight for humanity's very existence. And the stakes had never been higher. In the weeks that followed, as the invasion began in earnest, Marcus found himself at the center of the resistance once again. This time, however, there was no room for hesitation. The alien ships hovered above every major city, their energy shields making them virtually untouchable. Below, the bio-creatures were already on the ground, tearing through anything and everything that stood in their way. The resistance, though united, was struggling to maintain control. They didn't have the resources to fight the invaders on equal terms. They were outmatched in every way. Yet Marcus wasn't ready to give up. He knew that humanity's strength lay not in their technology, but in their spirit. The invaders had underestimated them once before, and they would do so again. But to win this war, they needed to do more than survive. They needed to fight back, and it had to start now. Marcus knew that if humanity was going to have a fighting chance, they had to strike first. They couldn't wait for the invaders to make the next move. He turned to the team of engineers and scientists who had worked tirelessly alongside him. There was no time to lose. The enemy was here, and they had one shot to make it count. The alien invasion was no longer a distant threat. It was now an unrelenting reality, and humanity had been thrust into the heart of the storm. As the invasion continued to unfold, humanity's greatest challenge was not just fighting the invaders, but finding a way to do so without succumbing to despair. The alien fleet was vast, and their technology was so advanced that the Earth's resistance forces felt like children fighting against a seasoned warrior. But Marcus Lane, still haunted by the events that had led to this moment, had no intention of giving up. Not yet. He had seen what humanity could do when cornered, and he knew that despite the overwhelming odds, they could still turn the tide. The Global Resistance Coalition had begun to grow stronger, and despite the panic that gripped most of the world, there was a shared sense of purpose that united governments, military forces, and ordinary citizens. Countries that had once fought among themselves now stood shoulder to shoulder, as if the enemy in the sky had reminded them all that human survival was the only thing that truly mattered. It was a time of unprecedented cooperation, as civilians and soldiers alike prepared to make their final stand. Marcus had long known that their weapons, even with the best scientists working around the clock, were insufficient. The electromagnetic cannons were powerful, but they hadn't been refined to the point of posing a real threat to the alien ships. The bio-creatures that followed the fleet were unstoppable behemoths, capable of destroying everything in their path. And there was a chilling reality Marcus had to face. No matter how hard they tried, humanity was still vastly outgunned. But Marcus had one advantage the invaders didn't account for: the will to survive. Humanity's resilience was their greatest strength. It wasn't just about advanced weapons or technology. It was about refusing to bend, to surrender. And in that spirit, Marcus refused to be beaten. The people who had fought in Montana, the townspeople who had stood with him when the world seemed to have crumbled around them, they weren't just soldiers. They were ordinary people who had faced an extraordinary threat and refused to bow down. Marcus had witnessed that courage firsthand, and he believed that the same spirit could ignite a worldwide resistance. But it was going to take a monumental effort. He knew the next move had to be theirs. Waiting for the invaders to make the first strike would be their downfall. The world had seen enough suffering, enough loss. The time for defense was over. They needed to go on the offensive. And that meant one thing. They had to hit the invaders where it hurt the most: their leadership. Marcus knew from the first invasion that the alien fleet was led by commanders, and those commanders were the linchpins of their war machine. If they could eliminate the command structure, they might stand a chance of destabilizing the entire invasion. But that was easier said than done. The alien commanders were unlike anything Earth had ever faced. They were towering, fierce, and strategic. They didn't make mistakes, and their forces were seemingly infinite. To take them down, humanity would need more than just technology. They would need a perfect plan and the right person to lead it. Marcus was that person. Whether he liked it or not, the world had placed its trust in him. He had given them hope when all seemed lost, and now it was time to deliver on that hope. The pressure was unbearable, but Marcus had no choice. Earth was running out of time, and if they didn't act soon, they might never get another chance. The first step in their offensive plan was to create a diversion, a distraction large enough to pull the invaders' attention away from the main target. Marcus and his team had begun building a series of high-powered electromagnetic weapons, similar to the one he had originally built, but on a much larger scale. These new weapons were designed to be able to pierce the alien ship's shields, creating weak spots where more concentrated firepower could break through. They would need to use the element of surprise and strike fast before the invaders could fully prepare for a counterattack. But building such weapons wasn't enough. They needed more than just a strong defense. They needed to mobilize the global resistance into a single force, one that could stand against the alien bio-creatures, the war machines, and the overwhelming might of the invaders' army. To do this, Marcus called upon the same townspeople who had fought alongside him in Montana, as well as resistance fighters from all corners of the globe. He knew that what they were about to undertake would be their most dangerous mission yet, and he couldn't afford any hesitation. The world's leaders had provided all the resources they could muster, but now it was up to the soldiers and citizens to carry out the plan. The operation was divided into several phases. First, a series of small teams would infiltrate the alien ships using underground tunnels and tunnels beneath the cities. They would sabotage key points in the alien fleet's infrastructure, disrupting the command and communication systems. Their goal was to cause as much chaos as possible without drawing too much attention. Once the diversion was set in motion, the larger resistance force would take action, attacking the alien command ship directly. For Marcus, the hardest part was watching people he had come to know and care about prepare for the battle ahead. The resistance fighters were all brave, but they were also scared. They had seen the destruction the aliens were capable of, and they knew that many of them wouldn't survive the fight. Yet they pressed on. They understood what was at stake. And for that, Marcus felt a deep sense of pride. The resistance fighters gathered in the makeshift command center set up within Montana. Maps of the alien fleet were displayed on large screens, detailing their movements, weaknesses, and strategic positions. The electromagnetic cannons, still in the process of being calibrated, were positioned around the town in preparation for the fight. They had to be ready to fire as soon as the first signs of the alien fleet entering the atmosphere were detected. But there was no turning back. The final countdown had begun. Each moment that passed felt like an eternity, but it also meant they were one step closer to striking back. Marcus spent long hours with his team, discussing every possible outcome and contingency plan. The stakes were so high that even the smallest mistake could cost them everything. At night, Marcus would often walk out to the edge of town, staring up at the dark sky. The first time he had fired the device that saved Earth, he hadn't fully understood the implications of what he was doing. Now, standing on the edge of a precipice, he felt the weight of his decisions. The future of humanity rested on their shoulders, and the pressure was immense. But he refused to let fear control him. If he failed, the world would fall. But if he succeeded, Earth might just have a chance to prove that it would not be erased so easily. One evening, as the resistance forces prepared for the assault, a high-ranking officer from the United Nations arrived. Her face was stern, her eyes filled with both determination and fear. She had news that confirmed Marcus's worst fears. The invaders had already begun the final phase of their attack. The fleet was on its way. "We don't have much time," she said. "The invasion has escalated. We need to act now." Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "Prepare the troops. We fight tonight." As the resistance forces gathered and the last-minute preparations were completed, Marcus felt a surge of energy in his chest. He knew what was at stake. Earth's future rested on their ability to act swiftly, decisively, and with overwhelming force. The alien threat might be vast, but humanity had something they didn't: the power to fight for their survival. The sky above began to hum, and the first ships broke through the clouds. The battle for Earth had begun. The sky above Montana darkened as the alien ships began their descent. The once peaceful landscape now looked like a battleground, a place where humanity's last stand would take place. The long months of preparation, planning, and sacrifice had brought them to this moment. The resistance forces, armed with whatever technology they could scavenge and adapt, stood ready. Their hearts raced, but their resolve was unshakable. The alien fleet loomed in the distance, monstrous and ominous, their energy shields reflecting the first rays of the setting sun. Marcus stood at the front of the resistance camp, his eyes fixed on the sky. The air hummed with an unnatural vibration as the alien ships continued their approach. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The pressure was unbearable, but it was a pressure he had come to accept. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had lost their home, their family, their future. This was for Earth, for humanity. Around him, the resistance fighters prepared. Soldiers checked their weapons, engineers fine-tuned the electromagnetic cannons, and strategists made final adjustments to their battle plans. The sense of unity that had developed over the past months was palpable. Humanity, once fractured by borders and politics, was now a single force, and in that unity there was strength. There was hope. "Is everything ready?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened with each passing second. "Almost," one of the engineers replied, his hands busy adjusting the massive cannon that had been set up near the outskirts of town. "We've got the main cannon operational, and the secondary ones are almost set. But we're not sure if they'll be enough." Marcus nodded, his gaze still fixed on the sky. The alien ships were now closer, their massive forms casting long shadows over the landscape. He could hear the faint hum of their engines, a sound that resonated deep within his bones. It was as if the very air itself was vibrating with the power of their arrival. "We'll make them enough," Marcus said, his tone resolute. "If we don't stop them now, it'll be too late." The last remnants of daylight disappeared, leaving behind a sky filled with stars and alien ships. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as the first wave of ships broke through the clouds. They were massive, some as large as entire cities, each one armed with weapons capable of turning the earth into a charred wasteland. But what Marcus saw made him hesitate for a brief moment. The ships were different this time, larger, more heavily armored, and surrounded by a pulsating energy field that seemed impenetrable. He had expected them to come back stronger, but seeing them up close, he realized just how much the invaders had evolved. "Hold your positions," a voice crackled over the radio, the urgency clear in the tone. "They're within range." Marcus took a deep breath and turned to the resistance fighters around him. "This is it. We hold the line. We fight for our future, for our families, for our world. Let's show them that Earth is not so easily conquered." As the alien ships descended further, the Resistance's electromagnetic cannons roared to life. A massive pulse of energy shot into the sky, slamming into the shields of the first wave of invaders. For a split second, Marcus felt a surge of hope. The shields flickered. They had made contact. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The cannons weren't powerful enough to bring down the ships, but they had made the invaders pause. "Yes!" one of the soldiers yelled. "We got them!" But the victory was short-lived. The alien ships retaliated with a force so overwhelming that it felt like the ground itself was being ripped apart. A wave of energy blasted through the air, sending shockwaves that shook the earth and knocked the resistance forces off their feet. The electromagnetic cannons were disabled in an instant. The Resistance's first line of defense had failed. Marcus gritted his teeth and looked up. The alien ships continued their descent, unhindered by the brief disruption. The bio-creatures that had accompanied the ships dropped to the ground with horrifying speed, their massive forms crashing into the earth, leaving craters in their wake. They were like living tanks, monstrous, deadly, and seemingly unstoppable. "Fall back!" the commander of the Resistance shouted, but Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. With the alien ships closing in and the bio-creatures wreaking havoc on the ground, humanity's resistance was being overrun. It was clear that the invaders had come prepared. The fighters on the ground, though brave and determined, were no match for the sheer might of the alien forces. The world's best-trained soldiers, armed with plasma rifles and makeshift weapons, fought valiantly, but they were pushed back with every passing minute. Marcus clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They needed something more, something beyond what they had. The knowledge of the alien technology, the weapon he had used to defeat them the first time, was slipping further away from him. He didn't know how to replicate it, didn't know how to use it again. The device had been built out of necessity, an improvised weapon that had only worked because of pure desperation. "Marcus!" a voice shouted, snapping him from his thoughts. It was the engineer who had worked with him on the electromagnetic cannons. "The secondary weapons. They're ready." "Good," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Deploy them. Now." The engineer nodded and sprinted toward the makeshift control center. Marcus's eyes remained on the battlefield as the first wave of alien bio-creatures began to move through the town, crushing anything in their path. Resistance fighters fired their weapons, but their shots merely glanced off the creatures' armored hides. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the invaders' ships released more creatures, and the town seemed to implode under the weight of the attack. Buildings collapsed, and fireballs lit up the sky as the resistance fought for their lives. Marcus could see the desperation in the eyes of his comrades. They were fighting a battle they had no chance of winning. But that's when he saw it. Among the chaos, a glimpse of something familiar. One of the alien command ships had strayed too close to the ground, and its energy shield flickered, momentarily weak from the sustained attack. It was a long shot, but Marcus knew this was their one and only opportunity. "Everyone, listen to me!" Marcus shouted over the radio, his voice cutting through the noise. "We have to take down that ship. It's our only chance." He didn't wait for a response. He couldn't. The moment was slipping away. Marcus sprinted toward the control center, grabbing the nearest weapon as he ran. The world around him felt like it was crumbling, but he couldn't let that stop him. Not now. The resistance was struggling, but they weren't done yet. There was still a chance, however slim, to strike back. He reached the control center and saw the technician working frantically. "Get the cannons back online. We're going after that ship." The technician looked up, his face pale but determined. "I'll need a few minutes." "Do it!" Marcus snapped. "We don't have minutes." With the cannons temporarily disabled, Marcus's mind raced. They couldn't wait for the cannons to recharge. They had to go after the command ship with everything they had. He grabbed the nearest plasma rifle and pointed it at the sky, signaling to the resistance forces. "Everyone who can fight, follow me! We're hitting that command ship now." As he led the charge, Marcus felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but humanity had shown its first true act of defiance. It wasn't over yet. They were still fighting, and they would fight until the last breath. The air crackled with tension as Marcus led the charge toward the alien command ship, which hovered ominously above the chaos below. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the sky was filled with fire and destruction. Bio-creatures rampaged through the streets, their monstrous forms towering over buildings, crushing anything in their path. But Marcus and the remaining resistance fighters weren't backing down. They had fought too hard to let it end like this. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to take their world back. Marcus's heart raced as he dashed through the debris, his rifle raised, his eyes fixed on the command ship. The flickering energy shield around it was weakening, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. They had to act fast. The resistance fighters followed him, their faces grim but determined, knowing that this was their last chance to make a difference. Each one of them was fighting for the future of humanity, for their families, for Earth. As they neared the command ship, Marcus heard the sound of engines roaring from above. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. The invaders weren't just sending biocreatures. They were sending reinforcements. Ships dropped from the sky, their massive forms descending toward Earth. It seemed like the invaders were everywhere, their forces multiplying by the second. But Marcus didn't falter. He couldn't afford to. The resistance had been pushed to the brink, but they still had a chance. They still had hope. "Keep pushing forward!" Marcus shouted to his team. "We're not backing down now!" They reached the base of the command ship, and Marcus saw that the alien soldiers guarding it were already prepared for them. Tall, armored figures stood in formation, their weapons raised. They were faster, stronger, and more advanced than anything humanity had ever faced. But the resistance didn't hesitate. They fought with everything they had, using every tactic they'd learned over the past months. Plasma rifles fired, grenades exploded, and hand-to-hand combat ensued as the resistance soldiers closed in on the alien forces. Marcus fought alongside them, his every move fueled by desperation and determination. The world around him seemed to blur. The deafening sounds of war, the heat of the explosions, and the screams of his comrades all faded into the background as he focused on his target. The command ship. It was their only hope. The alien soldiers, though fierce, began to falter. The resistance was relentless, and for the first time since the invasion began, it seemed like the invaders were losing ground. The energy shield around the command ship flickered again, weaker this time. Marcus knew they had moments, perhaps even seconds, to finish what they had started. "Now!" Marcus shouted, pointing toward a small opening in the side of the ship. "That's our way in." A group of resistance soldiers, including Marcus, sprinted toward the opening. The ship's defensive systems fought back, but the resistance pushed through. They didn't have much time. Marcus could see the control center inside the ship, filled with alien technology and strange, glowing devices. This was the heart of their operation. If they could destroy it, they could cripple the entire invasion. As they breached the control room, the alien commanders inside turned toward them, their cold, calculating eyes locking onto Marcus. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The commander in charge, taller and more menacing than the others, raised its weapon, its armor glistening in the dim light. It was clear they had prepared for this. But so had Marcus. Without hesitation, Marcus raised his weapon and fired. The shot hit the commander square in the chest, sending it staggering back. But it wasn't enough to defeat it. The creature's armor absorbed most of the blast, and it retaliated, sending a powerful wave of energy toward Marcus. He was thrown across the room, crashing into the metal walls with a sickening thud. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went dark. But Marcus wasn't done yet. The invaders had come to Earth expecting an easy victory, but they hadn't counted on the one thing that had kept humanity alive throughout history: their will to fight back. Despite the pain, despite the odds, Marcus pushed himself to his feet, grabbing his weapon with trembling hands. "Not today," he muttered through gritted teeth. The resistance soldiers continued their assault, focusing their fire on the remaining alien commanders. The battle raged on, but Marcus knew that the fight wasn't just about defeating the invaders. It was about sending a message to the universe that Earth wouldn't be an easy target, that humanity would stand its ground no matter how overwhelming the enemy was. With one final push, Marcus and the remaining fighters reached the heart of the command ship, where a large control panel pulsed with energy. This was it, the device that controlled the alien fleet. If they could destroy it, they could bring down the entire invasion force. But the alien commanders were already closing in on them, their weapons raised, preparing for a final strike. Marcus aimed his rifle at the control panel and fired. The shot hit, and the panel exploded in a burst of light, sending shockwaves through the ship. The explosion was massive, and the alien soldiers were thrown back by the force of it. The control systems of the ship began to malfunction, and the alien fleet's communication lines were severed. The invasion had been disrupted. But Marcus knew it wasn't over. The alien commanders, though stunned, would fight until the last. Their forces, though scattered and crippled, were still vast. The battle had only just begun. Outside the ship, the resistance continued to press forward, fighting for every inch of ground. But as Marcus and his team emerged from the command ship's wreckage, they saw something that made their hearts race. The sky had been lit up by explosions, and the massive ships that had once hovered in the atmosphere were beginning to fall. Some of them were breaking apart, pieces of them crashing to the ground below. The invaders were retreating. The command structure had been destroyed, and without it, their forces were falling apart. "Victory is within our reach!" Marcus shouted, rallying the troops. The resistance launched a final, coordinated assault, and in that moment, the tide of battle turned. The invaders, no longer organized or coordinated, were overwhelmed by the sheer determination of humanity. The ground forces were pushed back, and the remaining alien ships were taken down by the Resistance's weapons. The sky above, once dark with alien ships, began to clear. For the first time since the invasion began, the world could breathe. As Marcus stood on the battlefield, watching the last of the alien ships burn in the sky, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Humanity had won. Against all odds, Earth had fought back. But even as the dust settled and the world began to rebuild, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This victory, though hard-earned, was only the beginning. The universe was vast, and humanity had sent a clear message. They would not be conquered.